The Mongol War. They teach, and the one no historian dared to write. The ink freezes before it reaches the parchment here in this monastery, high in the mountains where few dare venture and fewer still return. My hands shake not from the cold alone, but from the weight of words I have carried for 47 winters, words that burned villages and toppled kingdoms, words that saved lives and damned souls. I write now because death stalks my shadow, and with me dies the truth of what we really did beneath the endless sky of the great Khan's empire. They teach you about Genghis Khan's conquests in your schools, don't they? The sweep across the steppes, the fall of Khwarezmia, the terror of the European campaigns. Clean lines on maps, dates to memorize, population estimates that sound like distant thunder, but maps cannot capture the smell of a winter camp where 10,000 horses breathe steam into the darkness, where felt tents creak under the weight of snow and the weight of secrets. Maps cannot show you the two wars we fought. The first war, the one your historians chronicle with such careful precision, was indeed terrible and magnificent. I was there when we reduced cities to ash, when our arrows darkened the sky like locusts, when the earth trembled beneath the hooves of the greatest cavalry force ever assembled. I saw Genghis Khan himself, a man smaller than legend would have you believe, but whose presence could silence a crowd of 10,000 warriors with a single glance. His eyes held the vastness of the steppe and the hunger of winter wolves. That war, the official war, was about conquest, about bending the world to the will of one man who believed heaven itself had chosen him to rule all beneath the eternal blue sky. But there was another war, fought in whispers and shadows, documented in scrolls that were burned before the ink dried, witnessed by men whose names were deliberately forgotten. I was part of that war too, and it has haunted every sunrise since. If you've found this account, if fate has carried these words to your eyes, then perhaps you're ready to learn why some truths are buried deeper than the graves of kings. Stay with me in this darkness, for the story I'm about to tell will change how you see the thundering hooves of history, how you understand the true face of empire. The Second War began not with the clash of swords or the thunder of siege engines, but with a whisper. I remember the exact moment because whispers in the Mongol army were rarer than rain in the Gobi Desert. It was the winter of our third campaign, somewhere in what you now call Kazakhstan, where the wind cuts through armor like a blade, and the stars shine so bright they seem close enough to pluck from the sky. We had just finished reducing a small fortress, whose name I've forgotten, another victory to add to the endless scroll of our conquests. I was serving as a scribe then, one of the few in our Tumen who could write in both Mongol script and the languages of the settled peoples. My name was Joki Temur, though few called me by name after that winter. Most knew me simply as the chronicler, the one who recorded the daily reports, the casualty counts, the inventory of captured goods and slaves. It was precise work, methodical work, the kind of duty that lets a man's mind wander while his hand moves across parchment. But that night, crouched beside a dung fire that barely held back the cold, I heard something that made my blood freeze in ways the steppe wind never could. Two officers were speaking in low voices near the command tent, their breath forming silver clouds in the firelight. One was Nayan, a captain whose cruelty had earned him advancement, but whose intelligence had earned him secrets. The other was a man I knew only by sight, tall and scarred, with the easy posture of someone who had killed often and slept well afterward. They thought they were alone in the darkness beyond the fire's reach, but sound travels strangely on winter nights, and my ears had been trained by years of transcribing hurried orders and catching half-spoken commands. "The Khan's mind is turning," Nayan was saying, his voice barely audible above the wind. "He speaks of mercy now, of leaving survivors to govern in our name. He grows soft with victory." The scarred man spat into the fire, sending up a brief hiss of steam. "Mercy is a luxury for settled peoples. We are wolves, not shepherds. What would you have us do? What we have always done. What we did at Urgench, at Merv, at all the places where our official reports speak of surrender and integration. Nayan's smile was visible even in the darkness, cold and sharp as winter iron. We continue the real war, the necessary war, the one that leaves no witnesses to contradict our chronicles. I should have crept away then, should have buried myself in my sleeping furs and forgotten what I'd heard. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, drawn by a terrible curiosity that would cost me everything I thought I knew about honor, duty, and the meaning of conquest. That night, I learned there were 2 sets of orders for every campaign, 2 versions of every battle report, 2 different wars being fought under the same banner. The official war was the one I had been chronicling faithfully for 3 years, the war of strategic brilliance and organized conquest that would echo through the ages. Cities that submitted were spared. Populations that surrendered were relocated but preserved. Local leaders who bent the knee were allowed to keep their positions under Mongol oversight. It was brutal, yes, but it followed the ancient patterns of empire building, the practical logic of ruling vast territories with limited manpower. But there was another war, fought in the spaces between the official reports. In the hours after surrender flags were raised, in the camps where prisoners were sorted and counted, this war had different rules, different objectives, different measures of success. Its purpose was not conquest, but erasure, not subjugation, but elimination. Those who fought this shadow war carried unsigned orders, spoke in code, and reported to a chain of command that existed nowhere in the official military hierarchy. The morning after my inadvertent eavesdropping, I began to see signs of this parallel conflict everywhere. The way certain prisoners disappeared during night marches, never reaching the designated camps. The coded messages that arrived with regular supply trains, written in a script I didn't recognize. The special units that rode apart from the main force, men whose faces I never saw clearly, who seemed to exist in the margins of our great host, like wolves following a herd. Most disturbing of all were the reports I was ordered to alter, to sanitize, to transform from accounts of slaughter into tales of strategic relocation. A village of 300 that had peacefully relocated according to my final draft had actually been put to the sword for harboring resistance fighters. A tribal confederation that had chosen to join our empire as valued allies had been systematically destroyed, their leaders executed, their people scattered to the winds. I wrote lies with steady hands and wondered if this was what scribes had always done, if all of history was built on such careful omissions and deliberate blindness. The weight of this knowledge grew heavier with each passing day. I began to notice how other members of our force dealt with the duality of our mission. Some, like Nayan, embraced the Shadow War with enthusiasm, seeing it as the true expression of Mongol superiority. Others went through the motions with mechanical precision, their faces empty of expression, their souls apparently hollowed out by repetition of necessary atrocities. A few, I suspected, fought an internal war against their orders, though they were careful never to let such doubts show in their words or actions. It was during our siege of a fortress, whose true name I'll never write, that I first encountered the one they called the Falcon's Shadow. He appeared in my tent one night without warning, a figure wrapped in the dark, felt that steppe riders wear for winter scouting. I had been working by lamplight, translating a particularly complex set of orders that seemed to contradict everything I understood about siege warfare, when he simply materialized from the darkness as if he had stepped through the tent wall itself. "You write well," he said, his voice carrying the accent of the western steppes, but something else underneath, something that spoke of education, of books, of a world beyond horses and bows. "But you write only half the truth." My hand instinctively moved toward the knife at my belt, but he made no threatening gesture, simply settled cross-legged on the felt carpet as if he belonged there. In the lamplight, I could see he was younger than his bearing suggested, perhaps 30 winters, with the lean build of a horseman, but hands that were too soft for someone who lived entirely in the saddle. "I don't know what you mean," I said, though we both knew I was lying. He smiled, and it was neither cruel nor kind, simply tired. "You know exactly what I mean. You've been documenting the First War for 3 years, the official conquest, the strategic masterpiece that will echo through history. But you've started to notice the Second War, the one fought in shadows, the one whose chronicles are written in fire and amnesia." "Who are you?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "I am someone who was ordered to ensure you never write about what you've seen. Someone who was told to add your name to the long list of scribes whose work became too dangerous, whose eyes saw too much, whose hands wrote words that could not be allowed to survive." He paused, studying my face in the flickering light. "But I am also someone who has grown tired of burning libraries." That night, the Falcon's shadow told me about the network of soldiers, scribes, and even some commanders who had begun working to preserve the forbidden history, to save at least some evidence of what really happened during the great campaigns. They called themselves the Keepers of the Second Chronicle, and they operated under constant threat of discovery, torture, and death. Their mission was not to stop the Shadow War, that was beyond their power, but to ensure that someone, somewhere, would remember what had really been done in the name of empire. "Every conquest has its necessary cruelties," the Falcon's shadow explained, his voice barely above a whisper, "but what we do goes beyond necessity. We erase not just cities, but the very memory of their existence. We destroy not just armies, but the stories that would explain why they fought. We are creating a false history to justify an empire built on lies." He showed me a hidden compartment in my own supply chest, one I had never noticed, where he had been storing copies of my original reports before I altered them for official submission. The sight of my own handwriting, documenting atrocities I had been ordered to forget, hit me with the force of a cavalry charge. Here was proof of the Shadow War, evidence that could destroy everything the Empire claimed to represent. "Why me?" I asked. "Why trust me with this?" "Because you still flinch when you write lies," he said simply. "Because your hand shakes when you transform murder into mercy on the page. Because you're not yet lost to us, though every day that passes brings you closer to the edge." From that night forward, I lived 2 lives as surely as our army fought 2 wars. By day, I was the faithful scribe, documenting the official conquest with all its careful omissions and strategic truths. By night, I was part of the resistance, copying forbidden documents, smuggling evidence to safe houses scattered across the empire, preserving the real history of what we had done in the name of the eternal blue sky. The work was dangerous beyond description. Discovery meant not just death, but the kind of slow, artistic execution that the Mongols reserved for traitors. Yet as the months passed, I found more and more soldiers willing to risk everything to preserve some fragment of the truth. A young officer who secretly recorded the names of villages that officially never existed. A supply sergeant who kept detailed logs of orders that were never written down. A shaman who memorized the dying words of chiefs whose tribes were erased from history. We developed an elaborate system of codes and signals, ways to identify fellow keepers and share information without arousing suspicion. A particular way of arranging writing materials on a desk, a specific pattern of knots in tent ropes, words that seemed innocent but carried hidden meanings to those who knew how to listen. We were scholars of deception, historians of the forbidden, archivists of atrocity. But the greatest secret we preserved was not documentation of what we had done, but evidence of what one man chose not to do. Deep in the archives we were building, hidden in caches scattered across the empire, lay proof of the times when mercy triumphed over orders, when conscience defeated duty, when individual soldiers chose to save lives rather than take them. These were not official acts of mercy, not strategic decisions to preserve useful populations, but quiet rebellions against the Shadow War itself. I remember the night I first documented such an act, transcribing the testimony of a young archer who had been ordered to eliminate a group of scribes and scholars captured during our siege of Urgench. Instead of following orders, he had helped them escape, providing horses and safe passage to the north. It was a small act of rebellion, meaningless in the grand scope of the campaign, but it represented something the Shadow War was designed to destroy: the possibility that individual choice could triumph over systematic brutality. The Falcon's Shadow collected hundreds of such testimonies, stories of soldiers who had chosen compassion over orders, mercy over efficiency. These accounts became the heart of our secret archive, proof that even in the darkest moments of conquest, humanity had found ways to survive and assert itself. We called these the chronicles of the other war, the war fought not with swords and arrows, but with small acts of kindness, with quiet refusals to participate in erasure, with the simple decision to remember rather than forget. As our archive grew, so did the danger. The commanders of the Shadow War were not fools, and they had begun to notice the subtle signs of resistance. Supply shortages that couldn't be explained by logistics, prisoners who disappeared but not in the official manner, reports that contained small discrepancies, hints that someone was keeping more accurate records than the sanitized versions filed with headquarters. The crackdown, when it came, was swift and brutal. I awoke one morning to find half our 2 men under arrest, their tents searched, their personal effects examined by investigators who had arrived during the night. The Falcon's Shadow was gone, vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only a coded message hidden in my tent. The archives must survive. The truth must survive. Some prices are worth paying. That was the day I learned that the Second War had always included us as targets. The keepers of the Second Chronicle were not just witnesses to the Shadow War. We were part of it, designated for elimination from the very beginning. Our work had been allowed to continue, not because it was secret, but because it was useful, drawing out other potential dissidents, creating a comprehensive list of those who might question orders, who might choose conscience over duty. They arrested me that morning, along with dozens of others who had been part of the network. We were taken to a special camp, isolated from the rest of the army, where the investigation proceeded with methodical efficiency. The interrogators knew everything, had copies of our codes, understood our methods, possessed detailed knowledge of our archive locations. We had been infiltrated from the beginning, our rebellion documented as carefully as any military campaign. But even in that moment of absolute defeat, I learned something that would sustain me through the torture and imprisonment that followed. The archives were not lost. The Falcon's Shadow and others like him had anticipated this moment, had prepared for the possibility of discovery and arrest. Our carefully collected testimonies, our preserved documents, our chronicles of the other war had been scattered across the empire, hidden in places where investigators would never think to look, entrusted to people who had never been part of our organization and thus remained invisible to our captors. The Shadow War had won the battle, but the truth would survive. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the empire, hidden in monastery libraries and merchant strongboxes, cached in mountainside caves and buried beneath desert stones, the real history of the Mongol conquest lay waiting for future generations to discover. The evidence of both wars, the official and the forbidden, the lies and the truth would endure. They never executed me. Those patient investigators, with their systematic methods and careful questions, Instead, they simply erased me. My name was removed from military records, my reports attributed to other scribes, my existence quietly deleted from the official history of the conquest. I became one of the disappeared, another casualty of the Shadow War, another name that would never be spoken in the halls of power. But erasure, I discovered, can be a kind of freedom. Officially dead, I was no longer worth hunting. Officially forgotten, I could move through the empire without fear of recognition. I became a wanderer, a collector of stories, a guardian of memories that had no official existence. For 47 years, I have traveled the roads of the empire, gathering the fragments of the forbidden history, preserving the testimonies of those who chose mercy over orders, who saved lives instead of taking them, who remembered when they were commanded to forget. The empire the world knows, the one celebrated in songs and feared in nightmares, is real enough. The Mongols did indeed conquer the largest continuous land empire in human history. They did revolutionize warfare, administration, and communication across the known world. They did create a period of peace and prosperity that connected East and West as never before. All of that is true, documented, verified by countless sources. But beneath that official history lies another truth, darker and more complex. The Shadow War left scars that have never healed, created silences that still echo across the centuries. Peoples who were not conquered but erased, their very existence denied by official chronicles. Leaders who were not defeated but forgotten, their names struck from the records as if they had never lived. Entire ways of life that were not just ended, but made to seem as if they had never begun. Yet even in that darkness, light persisted. The chronicles of the other war, the hidden testimonies of mercy and rebellion, prove that human decency survived even in the most brutal circumstances. For every act of sanctioned cruelty, there was someone who chose compassion. For every order to eliminate and forget, there was someone who chose to preserve and remember. The Shadow War sought to create perfect darkness, but it could never extinguish all light. I write this now in my final monastery refuge, my hands steady despite their age, my memory clear despite the decades. Tomorrow I begin my last journey, carrying the remaining archives to their final resting place, where scholars of future ages may find them and learn the complete truth of what we did beneath the eternal blue sky. The official war will be remembered in stone monuments and bronze inscriptions, in university lectures and military academies. But the forbidden war, the Shadow War, the other war, fought in whispers and silence, will survive only in hidden places, in secret archives, in the patient work of those who believe that truth, no matter how terrible, is better than the most beautiful lie. I have been the keeper of that truth for 47 winters, and now I pass that burden to whoever finds these words, to whoever has the courage to seek out the hidden chronicles and piece together the complete story of our conquest. The Mongol Empire was magnificent and terrible, revolutionary and destructive, the greatest military achievement in human history and one of its greatest moral catastrophes. It deserves to be remembered in all its complexity, with all its contradictions acknowledged, all its truths preserved. Both wars, the one they teach and the one no historian dared to write, shape the world we inherit. Both deserve their place in the long scroll of human memory. If you have listened to this account, if you have followed me through these dark passages of forgotten history, then you understand why some stories demand to be told, even when telling them risks everything. The truth is not always beautiful, but it is always necessary. The light is not always bright, but it never stops shining. And somewhere in the vast darkness of official history, the chronicles of mercy and rebellion wait to be discovered by those brave enough to seek them out. The Mongol Wars ended long ago, but the war between truth and erasure, between memory and forgetting, between the courage to witness and the temptation to look away, continues in every generation. Choose your side wisely, for the choice you make will echo long after your own name is forgotten, long after your own story becomes history, long after the last chronicle is written and the final archive is sealed against the judgment of eternity. Tentar novamente o Claude poder cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.